these skills and really practice and learn how to convey these ideas to policymakers. So communication is key to being successful in science policy. A lot of science policy professionals are seen as expert advisors because actually policymakers don't really have a science background, so they rely on scientists to provide information and evidence that they can base their decisions on. So it's really important to have scientists in policy. And obviously, as we have been trained as scientists, we think about this being evidence-based. You want to establish legitimacy and trust with your audience, and we'll talk about that. And also, one other really big point is making sure that your work is relevant to how the audience operates and what their needs are. So this will be dependent on the policymaker you're talking to, what their interests are. It has to be relevant to today's policy. So, you may have ideas about things that you want to write about, but it's most useful if it is relevant to what's happening in the federal policy or state policy if you're writing for state legislator. So in communicating with policymakers, specifically, continuing with this theme, so you want to frame what you're saying to their needs. When you can find out about what their interests are, obviously they have websites and there's all sorts of listservs and other ways to find out about what each legislator is interested in, and then going to that person to deliver your message. As I said, aligning the timing of your engagement with the political landscape, again, things that are being discussed now in federal policy, climate change obviously is a big topic, diversity, there are certain things that circulate at different times during the year, so it's good to align with those things. One other point is to remember that legislators have little time, so I always tell people this, that your summary of what you deliver to a legislator needs to be very quick, something that they can read from. Someone said this, and I like this analogy, that they have to be able to read and understand what you're trying to say in between the elevator and their desk, basically. So like 30 seconds, what is the message? So really practice honing down on that sort of quick summary, because a lot of times when you meet with them on the Hill, you get probably around 15, I don't know, if you get 30 minutes with them, it's a long meeting. So 10 to 15 minutes is usually what you get. And so you really have to prepare your message beforehand to be able to really hone in what you want them to remember. And again, engaging with real world policymaking. So again, there's a lot of, policy is a big topic. There's a lot of things you could write about and think about what is really happening today that you can relate to. And they'll be much more interested in that if you tie it to what's already going on. So in terms of specific principles, I'm sure you've seen this before, but thinking through who your audience is. So again, who is talking about which issues on the Hill, what sort of solutions can you propose to the problems that they have? So like I said, a lot of times they'll come to you for evidence and data and ideas about how they can implement certain things, or they may have certain policy priorities and are looking for ideas from you about solutions. And also framing these around constituency. So again, a lot of, obviously they will be interested in serving their constituents, and the issues that their constituents have are important to them and they want to hear from them. So again, knowing also what's happening at the state level is important, and just keeping in mind that they will have certain priorities. So the audience is key. Honing your message again, and this is, this probably takes the most practice, is doing something that is accessible, relatable, and meaningful. Again, depending on who you're talking to, should generally answer the question of why should I care? Very high level things like, how is this going to help a certain disease? For example, when I did my fellowship at Society for Neuroscience, we talked about how this is going to help somebody with Alzheimer's, but it's really a broader thing of a lot of these issues come down to the United States, and for example, how does science of the United States compare to other countries and that sort of thing. So the scale will be different also depending on who you're talking to and what they're working on. And then the medium, of course, we're talking about writing today, but more broadly around communication messages, thinking through how you speak versus writing about science to a policymaker will be different. There are different ways to communicate this in a writing session as well, whether it's a one-pager or a longer document. Sometimes you'll meet with them and give them a one-pager, and then they'll ask for more. So it's good to have also a longer version of the same thing that if they want more information. So then moving on to policy writing specifically. So and some of this does apply to JSPG as well, but it's good general principles. So you want to be using active verbs, analogies, and examples, so really conveying the urgency of the issue. Avoid jargon, which I'm sure you know, euphemisms, cliches, wordplays, and puns. So really being very specific, very objective in what you're saying. Again, they're not scientists. They want to understand what all these terms mean. So that you might be working on. So really keeping it very broad around climate change topics will resonate much better. And this, we'll talk about the sort of the structure of your message, and you want to include only details that are critical to your story. So a lot of times I think as scientists, we want to put sort of all the background, all the information that we have into a specific document. Really, they only need to know probably 2 or 3 critical elements to understand what your argument is and why you're doing that and why you're saying those things. So in that case, this is also a skill and takes time to hone really what you want to say and what the background will be to back up your main point. You do want to use facts, obviously, so do your research. This is it's a little different from the academic world because it's where these are posted, and also the background isn't always, there's not always publications around these topics, so there are different other resources and places to look for background information. And obviously, as you'll do here, creating an outline, writing takes a lot of practice, so you'll be doing a lot of editing, revise, rewrite, and also cite your sources. So this larger policy writing really falls under a larger question of how do we communicate to non-scientific audiences. This is a graphic that was made by somebody from ESAP a few years ago. So, it's interesting to think about the way that you would write to the public or a policymaker, which is very different. You're sort of flipping the argument from the academic writing. So scientists, usually we're used to putting the background first, having supporting details, and then results and conclusions. So when you're writing for non-scientific audiences, you want to put the bottom line first. You're sort of flipping the argument and saying, what is the main thing you want me to take away? Again, like the 30-second speech. And then the rest, you're sort of building out the argument of, okay, this is what I want you to remember. Why is that important? What is the sort of big picture relevance? And then supporting details, which can be facts, data, that kind of thing. So you really, it takes a while to kind of train your mind to be writing in this way, where you're really putting the first bottom line first and then building it out. So I want to tell you a little bit about the journal. So we'll come back to the writing, but I think it helps in the context of what JSPG does and how you might be able to publish some of this, and why I think it's so valuable. So JSPG is an internationally recognized open access and peer-reviewed journal. We're also a nonprofit, and we really are geared towards students and early career scholars to help them publish articles on a large number of areas in science policy. And we also want to elevate the publications on a number of platforms. So as I'll show you, we've done webinars, conferences, and so on, and really trying to get these ideas out there and hopefully also in front of legislators as the next step sort of after this. So that's some things we're thinking through. And the other piece of this is we really want to help bolster research and writing credentials in science policy. This is, as I'll show you again, we organize events to help writing as you're doing today. And also, we really want to be a platform for professional development as well. So you've probably seen this on the website. We publish a number of different formats, including memos, longer, shorter write-ups, and a number of different topics. So I won't go through this, but I highlighted a few here that might be relevant to what you're discussing here today, as far as, for example, energy, nuclear policy, geoscience. There's a lot of climate change as well, the environment, and then a lot of these topics do have DEI associated with them as well. But then there is also sort of the practice of science and including diversity and that kind of thing. So you're welcome to check this out. And it's quite a wide variety of topics on purpose, so that that you can find something to write about that you're interested in. So moving on to memos now specifically, this is actually from the website, all the different types of writing, which I think is useful just to look at this and think about how you want to convey your message. Obviously, we're talking about memos here, but just more broadly again, these different write-ups have different purposes. So most of them do have policy recommendations. Some of them present balanced views. So memos you would essentially talk about pros and cons of specific policies. You do want to recommend something to a specific audience. So not all these write-ups necessarily recommend a direction. And then op-eds, for example, obviously express the opinion of the author and is sort of one-sided. You're really making a one-sided argument, whereas some of these other ones is a more balanced view and you're really describing different policy options. So memos specifically, they're written by a number of folks. So they're actually really quite broad in the policy space, depending on who they're directed to. So I forgot to mention this, but the memos are typically directed to an individual. For example, I could write to, the VP of Federal Government Relations or to the president of the university or something like that. So it can be also internal to, you would essentially do the same thing as you would do to a policymaker. It can be directed to other sorts of individuals. So you can, and also they can be written by a number of folks. So policy advisors, advocates, everyday citizens who want to make change in their community. And they're fairly straightforward. So I'll go through an example with you, but you want to analyze an issue and offer recommendations that inform and guide a decision maker. So you are sort of pushing a specific direction. But you might also just say that, here's some evidence, and then you can decide which of these policy options you want to follow. So they can also be for people who are not necessarily in policy, what we call uninformed but intelligent readers. So again, people who are members of the public are interested in science. They don't necessarily understand policy, but they understand the broad relevance of these topics to their life. And of course, climate change is a big topic for everyone. So it can apply to other folks besides policymakers. One general principle is to keep it brief, be clear in what the points are, and also be objective. So thinking through, again, who you're speaking to, making sure you have really clear points. And this, again, takes some honing down from really, I think, maybe broad points into what specifics are and what, at the end of the day, what policy options you want to offer to them, and comparing these options to each other in terms of strengths and weaknesses, which is part of the writing process. and then you would then recommend a specific option. So in terms of, so I'll go through the structure in a second, but just to, again, think through this a little broader of, if you were to think about, maybe as I'm speaking, think about a topic that you want to write on in your group, and think about some of these questions. So what I would suggest is try to answer this question of why you're writing this. So who are you trying to convince of a specific issue? Are you writing this as yourself, or as your university, or as NSPN or something? So that, of course, the argument will be different depending on who you're actually representing in the memo. And what is the goal of the memo? So this question of why you're writing this, what are you trying to accomplish with the memo at the end of the day? And as far as background as well, so what prior legislation looks like, again, a lot of these memos come down to funding for specific programs, that sort of thing. And you want to then have some knowledge about what has been written on this topic before, if anyone has requested funding, how much that was, and it also, sorry. The political context, again, what has been done on this before? Is there legislation that you can use as a resource? So you don't want to reinvent the wheel, and you can use material that is already out there to build your memo on. So in terms of the structure, again, as I said, you want to start with the main point, takeaway, what is the 30-second message, use that to build on that, have some background and significance, explaining why this is important to them and just to society in general. And then you want to add, and there's specific elements here as far as the dimensions go, how feasible things are. So if you do come down to a few recommendations, thinking through some of these topics. How much is the recommendation likely to cost? How likely is it to be implemented? What is the practical side of that kind of thing? So there are other things here that you have to think about when you're comparing policy options. And then you want to recommend an option and have a blueprint. So this may or may not be part of the memo specifically, but it's helpful to think a little bit beyond to that. If they come back to you and say, okay, I like your idea, how do you want me to implement it? And having a plan is helpful. And this is actually very much real world too, that a lot of what we do in policy ends up being that you are, especially if you're working in advocacy, you're pushing certain priorities on the Hill. We have to have a strategy of how that will be implemented and sort of think through the advocacy side of this as well. So that is helpful to think about in terms of making this more actionable once you've written the paper. So here is one example. I use this quite a lot because I think it's pretty simple, but gives a good background of how you might formulate something like this. So this is just the executive summary, but you can sort of go through the structure here as you would to a memo. Sorry. Okay, so this memo essentially argues for going beyond animal experimentation. The structure itself, you can see on the left, you would write, if you're writing to somebody at the NIH, you would have a header saying who to, from, date, and subject. Obviously, this is you can imagine some official at the NIH. You would have a brief summary at the top, and then again build that out as you go, and then have alternatives, talk about limitations and barriers and conclusions. So in the specific memo, you can see it starts with saying that non-human animals, or essentially animal models, have been helpful for biomedical research for some time. This is useful because it helps human health. Again, they do have some citations in here. But what they're saying, however, even though animal models have been used for many years, it actually isn't very clear how useful they are for human disease. So they're arguing throughout the memo that animal models don't necessarily mimic human disease. They don't lead to the same response in human populations. Again, they have good data to back this up. And that's sort of the argument that they have. And so they're saying that the background is that these models have been used for some time. They're saying this isn't necessarily useful because it isn't always translated to humans. And then they go into sort of the argument and justification that there's a lot of variation between these models. That's an obstacle. And, they, again, sort of build this out more in the memo. And then the recommendation, their final section is they recommend the NIH expand efforts beyond animal models, establishing the Model Human Initiative, which promotes different technologies to supplant animal models, and you can read more about specifics, but essentially the argument is that we need an alternative to animal models. This initiative is something that we can do, and why it's important. The last part, again, it fosters understanding human disease and therapeutic intervention. So I think it's a good general example to think through something like this. It's somewhat simplistic in a way, but if you read through the paper, you'll see that there's a lot of data that backs it up. The introduction is pretty solid as far as painting the picture and the argument, and then making the argument, saying why this an alternative is justified, and then recommending what the alternative is, and then finish with why that's important. Again, the big picture relevance. So it's a good example to think through, and you can think through your examples or things you want to write about, how you might build out something like this. So now I wanted to also share a few examples of policy memos that were published in JSPG, so which I think might be useful as examples and places to look at for inspiration, but also you can see the sort of things that we publish on. As of course, climate change is a big topic. There's a lot of things you could publish on, and we try to keep the issues somewhat balanced as well. So this is the issue on climate change solutions that was published in June last year. It was sponsored by the UK Science and Innovation Network. So we did have some international events as part of this. But here are 3 memos. One is about equitable clean energy, climate resilient agriculture, and US coal communities. Again, just a few ideas. You can go through the issue, but that gives you some ideas about what to write on. And the other one I wanted to share, I'm sure you've seen this issue with NSPN on intersectional science policy, also from last year. This did have a mix of DEI, climate change, and DEI and other topics too. Again, I pulled out 3 examples for you to think through how you might integrate diversity in some of these topics as well. So one is about urban heat island effects and affordable housing, air pollution, and environmental justice. And the last one is about bike path and medicine. So this is actually also a good example because a lot of these are very specific to local communities, which are helpful as you're thinking through your writing. So now hopefully I piqued your interest in submitting, and as you're developing your writing, to give you a little bit of a background about what opportunities there are to publish, or sort of what our cycle of publication is. So our standard issues where we accept any format, any topic, again, climate policy would apply here. The deadlines are May and November, so you can see that here. And then we have currently 2 special issue deadlines. One is on STEM education and workforce development, which is actually coming up this weekend. And another one on science diplomacy, which is slightly, obviously different from what we're talking about today, but it could be helpful, and it will have some DEI as part of that too. So just things that are coming up. We'll have other things as well, but these are some opportunities to submit your ideas. And then wanted to just flag our diplomacy events coming up. First webinar is January 25th on science diplomacy to address global challenges. February 15th, it will be on inclusivity in science diplomacy. I think it's interesting. A lot of this is thinking more through how science policy is international. Most obviously, a lot of these issues do have diversity as part of this. And then we'll have a writing workshop in March, something to keep an eye out on. We haven't promoted it yet. But this is also something, if you didn't know, that we do organize webinars and workshops with all of our issues. So those are good opportunities to practice. Webinars, obviously you can hear from experts in the field and think through these ideas. And then the workshop is really where you can practice writing. And then wanted to just share a few opportunities for published authors as we're thinking through what other things, we don't want to be just a PDF online. We're really trying to think through how we elevate this work. So in relation to climate, I thought it might be interesting to show you some of the ways that we've done this. So on the left, and again, this is dependent on the partners that we work with, but this issue was sponsored by the UK Science Innovation Network. And so our authors, this is from Twitter, but they presented at the British Embassy in DC a few months ago. So this was really nice, nice sort of blend between students and high level folks who work on climate change issues, and they had really nice discussions. I think they really enjoyed talking about their papers, and this is a way to get those ideas out there more into these discussions. We also organized an event with ASU Climate and Center for Science and Imagination. So they have this climate fellowship. Libya, Vandana, and Hannah were 3 of the fellows, and this was also interesting. They actually we had the authors talk about their publications and think about how you can sort of create stories around this. So they created kind of scenarios. The ASU, they do a lot of kind of creative writing and also thinking through how do we take these ideas more into an applied scenario. So they design kind of a local story, how they might apply these ideas. Very interesting. And then the last one is our podcast, which is on hold right now, but we will pick it up again. So we do also interview published authors, and this is one of the episodes we had on environmental policy, where we could try to get the authors to talk about what they do or what they wrote on. Another opportunity, you probably have seen this, but just a flag also, we do have opportunities for the editorial board, which just opened a few days ago. We're doing 2 cohorts this year, so we're anticipating a lot of issues and a lot of publications. So we're doubling our number of editors, hopefully. So this is a great opportunity to participate in the editorial process, work with our leadership, who's very experienced, and really I think a lot of folks have gained a lot from this over the year. So this is kind of part of our professional development, and we'll welcome you to apply to this as well. So just to leave you with, and I can share these slides, a number of writing resources. So I usually use a lot of these I use in these talks. Some of them are more general about writing policy. Other ones are just memo specific. They're really helpful. There's one from Seattle on inclusive language, which I didn't talk about today, but something else to think about. So I'll share these as you all can think through. And I think Alicia might have shared these too. They're helpful as you're thinking about writing your memos. So, and then I'll share this in the chat too. We also invite you to follow JSPG on all of our channels. We have a newsletter. We put all of our writing workshops and webinars on YouTube, so you can subscribe to that. We'll be posting more there, and follow us on social media for future events and issues. And then finally, my contacts, I can send this as well. If you'd like to chat more about policy or the journal or anything like that, happy to connect on LinkedIn or Twitter as well. That's it.
Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Thank you, Adriana. And I'm assuming you'll be dropping some of these resources in the chat, also through email.
Yeah, so I have here, actually, I did save all of our channels here. So actually, I mentioned this to Alicia, but our website is down today, but keep them on hand. You'll be able to log in, but you can follow the social. And then I think, yeah, the other ones, are not, I mean, they're in the slides, so I can maybe just, let me see actually if there's anything specific I can pull out of this. Yeah, so. Yeah, were you able to send these beforehand?
Some of the links I was able to send, the ones that are related to like the actual JSPG website, are obviously down today.
Yeah, so I think this one, so this is a good video from UPenn. Oops. Sorry. From UPenn. Oops, sorry about that. There we go. Okay.
Okay.
That's video you can use. Yeah, I think I can send these to you. I think one other one. This is a good guide for writing. And then one more general one from Alex Kaplan. Okay. This is also a good resource for writing. Those are the main ones I would say. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for that presentation. It was really informative. And I want to take this time too, before we actually go into the breakout rooms, to open the floor for any Q&A. Questions that you have, clarifications, advice that you may want on writing, or things like that. So you can unmute yourself, or you can place your question in the chat, whichever is more comfortable for you.
I actually have a question. So Adriana, in your experience with people who are interested in writing policy position papers, policy memos, op-eds, and wanting to submit to journals like yours, there are a lot of topics that you listed in your slide that people are passionate about, very interested in, and would absolutely want to see their writing lead to policy change. So with all that said, there's a lot of stakeholders for all these various topics. Have you seen events that have been hosted where people could connect with one another that might not have been involved in writing these types of papers? So they have a very science background, have an interest in policy, but haven't had much experience. I know that NSPN has held some events, but can you talk more about how people can connect with one another with similar interests or aligned interests to write together?
Yeah, so I think we do something similar to this. And actually, I do have one link I can share this, the last one memo you can look at. Yeah, a lot of times actually these writing workshops, it's very organic that people do end up submitting together from the event where they work on an outline together and they decide to write the paper together. So this is creating some community. I would say one thing we're focused on now is how do we really take these ideas into action, which is not an easy thing, but especially now because we're still virtual. But for one of the groups that published, we actually submitted a response to the OSTP DI challenge. So trying to think through like, we got published authors together and then wrote a response to the White House, essentially what we think about, what young people think about diversity in science. And it was based on their papers, but again, kind of using the papers as like an initial thought process to build something from here. And then, it was exciting. Everybody was really interested in that. So that's the other thing you could think of. So sort of the two ends of the spectrum. One is you're writing as a group and then you're submitting to the journal or maybe other places. And the other one is once it's published, and how do you leverage that into something that maybe you do want to approach policymaker with, or you want to submit to, there's a lot of these kind of RFIs and where they're looking for responses from scientists on different topics that you can submit. So that's it.
Are there any other questions that anyone has? If not, I do have a question, but I do want to give other people the chance to speak up if they do. I guess like a question that I had in regarding to, because a lot of times like some of the policy issues that we do talk about, right? A lot of them are kind of interweaving into each other. And so I guess like, how do you decide on that point of like when you stop? Because like you could keep writing something until it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and you could have like 10 different policies that can be used to address one thing. So I guess like general strategies for like breaking the problem down essentially before it gets like too big and you're put everything into one policy memo.
Yeah, I would say it takes practice. So if you're looking at the memo that I shared, the last link, it really only comes down to probably 4 or 5 recommendations, out of which they recommend, okay, this is the policy that we think should be enacted. The background I think depends on the topic and also sort of what's happening. So I would say following maybe the federal policy of what's going on. So it's like climate change. We also are working on this and following what Biden is doing. And, there's a certain point that like there's legislation on these topics that are in certain stages. So for us, it's, we try to influence the process to a certain extent, but there is an end date, hopefully at some point, to some of this policy policy change. So I think it depends also on what angle you want to pursue, or you could probably pick bits and pieces of what Joe Biden is doing on climate, and maybe pick one area and then expand that. Really, you can write a memo just on that specific thing. Like I showed you some of the things were like biking and medicine or something like that. So if you want to impact something that's local, that's a very specific issue, then you really focus on that. Otherwise, I think it can also be broader, like, you know, we've had things around diversity in science, how we need more courses, that sort of thing. That was a very broad paper. So I think it really varies as a large spectrum, and also depending on what you want to accomplish. So again, if you're targeting like a state legislator and you're saying we need more bike paths in Maryland, that's a topic. If you're saying we need more diversity in science and this is for, you know, Biden to do something, that's a different framing. So really there's a lot of ways you could go about it.
Mm-hmm. And could you also target like professional organizations? So say like you are doing something in like health disparities or something like that, and similar to how some doctors or like OBGYNs may belong to a certain professional organization. Could you target that, or do you need to think bigger? I guess I should say.
Yeah, I think you could. You know, there's a lot of advocacy around health issues these days, I think, and also virtual advocacy days to participate in. Although I will say that I think a lot of times, if there are topics like this that are more broad, you might think about just writing about the general state of, you know, the health, I don't know what was health policy, arguing for more diversity. You could say, maybe you could have multiple stakeholders, like AMC, for example, could be the association, you know, they only do certain things. And then you could say, we also want NIH to do something, which is something else. Like NIH could put money towards this, AMC could organize events, I don't know, there's a number of things, right? So I guess that's a good way to look at it too. It's like, or you could just direct the whole thing to the NIH, like what I showed you was just like, this is really, because that's very specific, like we want the NIH to develop this program, like this is why. I don't know. I would say look, well, not today, but look through some of the examples on the website and see kind of you'll get an idea of the different like levels and the different scope of these things. We've definitely had things that were, like I said, they're very like honing in on a specific local issue, and then other ones were very broad topics.
Okay. Okay. Oh, and we do have a question in the chat from Marianne. Where they're asking, does narrowing the focus of a policy topic to the local level have more of an impact than something more broad? Especially as you had briefly mentioned, like the steps after these memos get published towards something actionable.
I would say not necessarily. So both state and federal policy, I think, have different levels of impact. In some ways, I think you might be able to reach your local legislators more and, you know, build a relationship, and they do listen to constituents. But there's a lot, I mean, depending on the topic too, I think there's a lot of things on the federal level related to science and the STEM workforce. And, you know, we actually worked on some legislation on this to where, so this is, you know, part of something that you can do is we actually wrote legislative language to be included in one of the bills that was circulating for about 6 months last year. So federal policy, I think I personally like it because I think you can have a bigger impact. It's harder to see it, I think, because it's so high level, and, you know, we write letters to OSTP, for example, and say, you know, Eric Lander, you know, we request this and this and this, and you may or may not see that. But also if you go through the process and, you know, that your request actually gets included, then it's a big deal. So I do think that federal policy does have a bigger impact, in my opinion. But you know, again, I think it depends on what you're passionate about and what you want to change, and both of them work. So.
Great. And I guess like the final question I have, if anybody else has a question as well, you mentioned that anybody can, or any team can write these policy memos, correct? It's just about getting the right, because like you said, I think, or Jenny mentioned, we're all passionate about different things. And sometimes the things that you're passionate about, it may not necessarily be like what you study day in and day out. Right. So I guess like, how would you go about, I guess like reaching out to people? It's like, hey, I'm really passionate about this thing and I want to write about it, but I also want to collaborate with you so that, you know, I'm not writing something that's not factual or anything like that.
Yeah, I think this speaking more from having a day job in policy, it's very collaborative when you're putting forth, and obviously I work in advocacy, so we're pushing different issues and different sections or different opinions on things to different constituents. But like when you ask the question about the health disparities, I think a lot of it ends up being a group effort sort of in the real world, to where you're writing like a document of priorities, for example, saying, our university really values this specific topic. A lot of other schools will do the same. So when we send things to the Hill, it'll be a common letter saying these 20 universities agree on this idea and we want you to do it, right? So it is, and then you have things that are like, the UC system cares about specific things, then we do our own advocacy about what we want to see. But then there's broader things within like the higher education community, or, a lot of, like I said, a lot of universities will have common priorities, and then it's more likely that it will get done or get in the right hands because it is a common document and we pass it back and forth and we say, okay, it's done, then send it to the Hill, right? To the timing question, I think because you asked about this too, and there are certain times during the year when bills are moving, when it's better to try and get something in front of a Hill staffer, as opposed to, you can kind of find, like, if you've been in the field long enough, you can kind of see like when that time is, and then, they're likely, or just, talk to them and they're likely to make a decision on the bill, the specific, like they say like, okay, by April, we want to pass this bill. And then, like, this is your window to get this ready and send it in. And so there's, like I said, this is why I emphasize the timing aspect, because, there are certain times of year, I think, when you can send things in that they may actually be read and incorporated. Whereas, like, after April, it's too late because it's already passed. So that sort of thing. So you kind of see that once you've been in the field for a while and see kind of how things move in on the Hill.
Okay. Alrighty. Thank you. Once again, last chance. After this, we will have Adriana sign off and we'll go into our different breakout rooms. But before that, if anyone has any additional questions or last minute questions that they would like to ask.
Hi, this is Shay. Thank you for the presentation. My question is just, I guess, more broad, the training that you have in the background. Do you think it prepared you for your current role? And are there other, trainings or classes that you would recommend taking in order to kind of become better at this process? Because it seems like it's like a lot is on-the-job training, right? Where you have to transfer those skills that you learn in class, but it's kind of hard, especially when your audience are not from the same background. So can you speak a little about, how you kind of became the expert at doing what you currently do?
I wouldn't say that, but okay. Yes, I agree. A lot of it is on the job. So I actually, it's interesting. Having an academic background was actually really useful for working for a university, because you understand the academic side and the policy side, and I'm sort of the middle person. I can understand both perspectives. I think, what I brought here, and having a PhD, and that is valuable, because there's a lot of things that you're translating and bringing here, like you'll manage projects, you work on collaborative documents. There's things that translate, I think, from your training into policy. A lot of it is And I do think that the workshops that we do are helpful because it gets kind of your brain trained in this way, and these things are helpful. And they did actually read my papers when I applied for this job, so it does actually apply in the real world that writing a policy paper does actually help. But then when it comes to being on the job, there's a lot of kind of just learning how things work. I mean, I'm in an interesting space, I guess, about like working for a university system and understanding how things work. You're part of also a broader higher education community. We work with associations, like APLU and AAU. We work with other institutions. So there's a lot of that. You're just kind of like learning how the system works for a few months, and then what priorities are important. And then, I think it's also different based on what your job is. So like I said, we work, where we are doing a lot of advocacy. Not everyone does that. So other kinds of jobs are more like you're writing reports that someone like me, an advocate, would use as a resource or background to then advocate for something. So, but that being said, the advocacy side actually does also have quite a strategy to it too. Like I was saying, the timing, like knowing who to go to, who am I going to go to on the Hill? Who cares about this? What time of year do I do it? What other universities should I approach? There's all sorts of this, like the strategy of advocacy itself. I think once you have your ideas and how do you then take that forward and who do you send it to on the Hill, that sort of thing. So I enjoy it. I think it's, it's interesting. You really, I feel like, I'm using my background, but also I think that's part of, I would say, why I like being in the federal space, because you're really always kind of in the action and things are always moving, bills, things are happening. You feel like you're a part of something that's always moving forward, and, you have a way to impact it. So that's pretty exciting. But yeah. I'm happy to also chat more about the job if you'd like. I'll share my contact info. If anybody has kind of career questions or that kind of thing, I'd be happy to chat.
Thank you very much for asking the question. Thank you.
Yeah, good questions.
All right, thanks. Okay. Well, Adriana, thank you once again for coming and sharing your time and presenting today. It was very informative in sharing your experiences. I think from this point, we will send you off and say thank you again. And yeah, have a great rest of your day. And I guess if you have any last words for the group or anything like that, please do share.
Yeah, always happy to help. I will say, be on the lookout for next deadlines and events. And if you want more practice, we'll have more workshops that you can practice in, and hope to see your submissions.
All righty. Okay, well, great. Thank you. Thank you so much. And we'll probably see you later. Some of us will probably see you later for sure.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.